Welcome to Gospel Tangents, the best source for Mormon history, science, and theology. I'm Mark Bennett. We're winding down the year 2021, as well as our fifth year here at Gospel Tangents. Wanted to look back on some of the wonderful people that we've lost this past year. And this time we're going to look at Curtis Allred Bench. He's the owner of Benchmark Books, and I'll let him tell you more about that here in a minute. Curtis Allred Bench was born November 17, 1952 in Los Angeles, California. One of the fun things about that, I remember talking with Curt in the bookstore and telling me how he used to sell programs and things at the Rose Bowl in Pasadena, and he had some very interesting stories to tell about getting robbed even as a young boy. So anyway, Curt served a mission in the Alabama-Florida mission, and this is where he began his LDS book collection. Curt graduated from BYU, where he met and fell in love with Patricia Gaffney Bench. They married and had 4 children. Some of those still work at Benchmark Books, by the way. Curt worked for and later managed the stores in Deseret Book, and in 1984, he opened the rare book department there. In 1987, Curt opened his own store, Benchmark Books, which continues today and has become a gathering place for Mormons of all stripes. Curt envisioned a religion that includes beliefs across the spectrum, a true Big Tent proponent. Curt was a member of the Utah Westerners, Mormon History Association, Sunstone Education Foundation, John Whitmer Historical Association, and Utah Historical Society. He was an honorary member for life there. So when I recorded my interview with Curt, he was my 6th interview ever. Back in 2017, and he said this was the 30th year of Benchmark Books. So I thought it would be fun to look back on some of those fun conversations that we had with Curt and talk a little bit more about his bookstore and that sort of a thing. So Curt has a wonderful bookstore. I've bought way too many books. I've paid Curt a lot of money already. So,
well, we'll decide whether you've bought too many.
So anyway, I know Curt was involved, was actually good friends, as I understand it, with Mark Hofmann, and kind of has a real first-hand view of things. And so I wanted to talk to you a little bit today about your experiences, what you remember, and that sort of thing about the whole Mark Hofmann saga. So. But before I do that, do you want to give a little short commercial for your bookstore here and how you got started?
Of course, you don't have to twist my arm to do that. Well, this is our 30th year as Benchmark Books, and before that I was with Deseret Book Company, and that's where I got to know Mark Hofmann. I headed up the fine and rare books department, but another part of my life. But we've been at this location, which is I don't know how specific you want me to be, 3269 South Main Street in Salt Lake. We've been here since 1994. Prior to that, we had a little store down on Rio Grande Street, down by the Utah Historical Society. And we moved here in 1994 and have been going, strong ever since. There's always ups and downs in the business, but we specialize in LDS books, in print, out of print, used, rare, the whole gamut. We find out of print books for people. We have lots of new books, lots of in-print books. We specialize in Mormon studies, so you're likely to find some of the more serious history and biography and theology. We don't stock every LDS book that comes out. That's not our mission, but we've been doing this a long time, and we've had some wonderful things come through our hands, some really rare things in addition to the whatever books that you and others like to buy that aren't necessarily collectible, but just for good reading and for research. Have a small staff there's 4 of us all together, but everybody knows their stuff and they like doing what they do, and we love our job here and helping people find books that they're looking for that will give them some kind of fulfillment, whether it's for research or for pleasure.
Well, I think it was the last Mormon History Association meetings. I promised myself I wasn't going to buy any books. And then I walked by your table and I bought like 3 books. So.
Well, so you shouldn't have that attitude to begin with about not wanting to buy books.
I don't even read all the books that I have, but it is nice to have them. So one of the books that I did buy was the Turley book and I've just actually been reading through that to kind of brush up for this as well. So
it's an important book on the subject.
Yeah. So what are some of the best books on the Hofmann case?
The first one that most people turn to is Salamander, the story of the Mormon forgery murders by Linda Silito and Alan Roberts. And then Rick Turley's Victims offers some insights, kind of an insider's view that they weren't able to because Rick was employed by the church and had full access to general authorities and others who were involved, and was able to get a lot of important material. And he interviewed lots of people. And so, as we talked about earlier, I think if you read those 2 books, you'll get a really good overview of what happened. In fact, more detail than you'd probably remember. But they're both balanced and filled with important information, relevant information. Another good one is, I'll see, I've gone and done exactly what I was trying not to do, but Gathering of Saints, sorry about that, by Robert Lindsay. As an outsider, I think he did a very respectable job. He was kind of on the scene fairly early when it came to books, and he's the one that did The Falcon and the Snowman, which was a national bestseller and made into a movie. I think he did a decent job, and there were lots of other books that mention Hofmann, and there's some that weren't very good. There have been lots of documentaries and lots of articles and other things that have been done on the subject. This year will be 32 years since the bombings, and so, but the interest is still quite high, I think, for something that happened that long ago.
Well, murder is a kind of an interesting subject, especially when it comes to religion, I think.
Well, that's true, and we've never had anything like that happen in Utah or in Mormon history per se. Certainly there's been violence from time to time, but that was such an unusual, horrendous, dramatic kind of story. It is intriguing, but very sad and tragic.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's talk about, kind of the beginnings. I mean, how you actually knew Mark Hofmann. How did you get introduced to him?
Well, I tell people I didn't know him as well as I wish I had, as I should have. And when you said we were good friends, we were friends, but we did a lot of business together. He had kind of established himself as I guess today what would we say, kind of a rock star. I mean, he had made some amazing discoveries of Mormon documents, the Anton transcript and things like that got him a lot of attention. And I met him, and I was in the same business, although we hadn't really done documents very much, maybe once in a while, but we did a lot of rare books and other collectibles. And so I was kind of excited to meet Mark Hofmann, who had gotten all this attention and had established himself as an expert in documents, and as well as other things, rare books and things. So it made sense for me to get to know him and to do business with him, and we did a lot of business over the next few years.
What approximately, do you remember what year it was?
About 1980 or 81, somewhere in there. And then,
so by that time he'd already established a name for himself,
yes,
as finding a lot of rare books and coins and things.
Yeah, by the time that I met him, he had already made some discoveries that got him a lot of media attention, and so he came into my store. I was managing one of the Deseret bookstores, and he came in and introduced himself, and I hate to say it, but the rest is history.
Well, great. What were some of the things did you purchase things from him?
Oh, we purchased lots of things from him. And not all Mormon stuff, too. I mean, he presented us with things that were fascinating, but most of it was Utah or Mormon related. But I mean, sometimes we would take things on consignment. I remember we had a Martha Washington document. Some of the things, I mean, I could recall some of the things that came through our hands. There was a promissory note that was signed by Orrin Porter Rockwell with his ex. Elijah Abel, the black who held the priesthood, a document that had his ex. Mark was good at doing X's, apparently. And we had a Daniel Boone document. I'm just trying to think of some things that weren't just in the Mormon field. And some things were books, but quite often they were documents. And so this was my big foray into that field. I was a relative novice when it came to Mormon manuscripts and documents. And so I kind of let him guide me in a lot of cases. And when he wasn't dramatic at all and didn't really seem like he was trying to sell you. You know, he wasn't a used car salesman type at all. He was quiet and introspective, but he never made a big deal about things. But often he would say, "It's a nice item," you know. But he would tell you the background and why he thought it was saleable, and it would always give you a good enough deal that you didn't feel you could pass it up. And if anything ever went wrong, he would take it back. I mean, one time, I don't remember when it was, but we had a signed Brigham Young photograph, and I sold it to a man who was very knowledgeable about such things, and he took a look at it and examined it closely and returned it because he said it's a forgery. That's not Brigham Young's signature. I can't remember all the details now, but he determined that it couldn't be good because of the paper and so on. And so I told Mark, and he said, "Oh, no problem. I'll talk to the guy I got it from, you know, and I'll try to get my money back."
Oh, wow.
Yeah, he did that a lot. So if there was ever a question about something, he would take it back, and then he would always, you know, well, I'll talk to, you know, my source about that.
Okay, so there were cases where, I mean, because it sounds like he wasn't really unmasked until the bombing, but there were cases before that.
It wasn't at the bombing. It was considerably after that he was really unmasked.
Oh, okay.
It took a while.
But even before, there were cases where people would say, "This looks like a forgery, I don't believe this," and so they'd get their money back or whatever.
Occasionally.
Okay, so it wasn't a frequent thing, but there were...
It happened, times. But Steve was his first victim, and that was that morning, and then she was early afternoon. And then, well, you know, I don't know how much background you want, but that day, I talked to Mark on the phone the day of the bombings.
Oh, really?
Several times, probably 6 or 7 times. And I called first to warn him about the bombings, bombing at that point, because, you know, there was a lot on the news. I was actually driving to work that morning, and they said there was a bomb that had gone off in the Judge building, which was just a few blocks from where I worked. And they even, as I recall, gave the office number and said a young businessman had been killed. Well, I only knew one person in the Judge building, and that was Steve Christensen. So as soon as I got to my office at work, I looked up in my directory under his name, and there was that office number in the Judge building, and I was just sick physically. I mean, it was horrible. And so I felt that I needed to confirm. They didn't give a name on the news, so just so happened that Matt Christensen's store, the main store, was in the ZCMI Center where Deseret Book also was. And I would see him and say hello down there. And so I ran down to his store, and he was talking to two men. I don't know who they were, but there were tears streaming down his face. So that
Matt
was
Christensen's
Max.
Mm-hmm.
That's when I knew that it was Steve.
Mm.
So I went back and called Mark Hofmann's phone, and one thing about him is you could never just reach him on the phone. You either had to leave a message on the machine or talk to his wife. He would always call you back. You could never just call him. And so I got the answering machine, and I said, Mark, this is Curt. This is an emergency. Call me back immediately as soon as you get this. And a short time later, he called and just kind of lightheartedly said, Curt, this is Mark. You said it was an emergency, but then everything's an emergency with you. Just making a joke. And then I told him what had happened, and that Steve Christensen had been killed, and there was a sharp intake of breath, and what? Like he was genuinely shocked. And I told him everything I'd heard, and it was as if he'd never heard a thing. And I warned him, told him to get his family out of the house, to go, get into hiding, whatever, because we didn't know what was going on. And
so because I know originally it seems like, because Steve was a financial thing, there was a lot of people that thought, well, this must be something to do with his finances. But you originally thought this has something to do with...
Well, I didn't know.
Oh, okay.
Nobody knew. And that very day there was speculation about, did it have something to do with Mormon documents? Because, Steve had been in the news with... I'm trying to remember about the news part, but certainly it was known that he had been involved in trying to get the Salamander letter. And so...
so you made the connection that you thought it could have been?
Well, it could have been, yeah. But there was speculation early on about, was this business related? Because there were angry investors with the Sheets Company, CFS, and then after the... let me get back real quick. So I told Mark, let's stay in touch. So then when there was a second bombing, and it was Kathy Sheets, who was married to Gary Sheets of CFS, Steve's old boss or partner, I can't remember I think they were partners, but so then it seemed like it must be business related. And there was there was all kinds of speculation. Even later we find out some wondered if it was the mafia or, just angry investors or, what the heck was going on. Nobody knew. And so I talked to him several times that day. And as I looked back, I could see that, by the questions he asked me, he wondered about how this was playing out in the media and with what people were saying, and well, what are they saying? And, is this... So after the second bombing, I remember him saying something about, well, it must be business related. And I said, well, not necessarily. It could be Mormon documents. Gary Sheets had some involvement or knowledge of the Salamander letter, and, there were some connections there. And so I said, who knows? And I said, you need to get your family out. And he goes, okay, I will. But yeah, we talked several times that day, and in retrospect, I can see how I was kind of his sounding board to see how his scheme was working.
Did he answer his phone that day?
No, he always called me back.
I guess this was before cell phones.
It's possible, yeah. Although he did have a car phone. I think.
Oh, really?
Back then, yeah, I think so.
It was a little big brick, right?
I don't know how those worked. No, it's possible I could have gotten him once that day because that was a real dramatic thing. But generally speaking, you couldn't just call him up and get him. In fact, a lot of times I had to go over to his house. He lived a mile or mile and a half from me, and in fact, one of the big ways that I was involved with Steve and him is Steve needed me to convey some information to Mark And so I literally went over to his house and talked to him, which I had to do frequently because it was too frustrating to try to get him on the phone. Sometimes it was just easier to go see him.
Oh, wow.
And, we did things socially there. We had dinner with him and his wife a number of times. Even had hot tub parties, which we didn't go to those, but yeah, we considered the Hoffmans friends and did things socially as well as a lot of business. So remember I told you about warning, Mark, and so the next day, which is the 16th of October, I'm driving. Actually, I had been somewhere to try to negotiate a deal that was based on information I had gotten from him. So I'm driving back to my office, and on the news it said there was a third bomb. And keep in mind, this is surreal for our area. I mean, these bombings are going on. Nobody knows what's going on. Nobody knows why. There's a lot of fear. There's a lot of uncertainty, and then when there's a third bomb, and then I find out that it's Mark Hofmann that's the victim, I about drove off the road. And I remember hitting my steering wheel and saying aloud to myself, Mark, why didn't you listen to me? He didn't seek safety, and he was the third victim. And then they started on the news, they were speculating that he might be a suspect, which was a whole new twist. And so at that point, and there's lots of phone calls, and a lot of us are talking to each other, speculating, and what have you heard, and comparing notes and so on. But then when they're looking at him as a suspect rather than just a victim, more than one of us, there were a few of us who decided that we better go tell the Salt Lake police what we knew, just because we don't know what's going on, but we do know some things that might be helpful. So Shannon Flynn, who was involved in a number of ways, he and I were down there at the same time, as was Wade Lillywhite, who has more in the story later. But we were interviewed by the detectives, and I remember reviewing with them all these events. And at the time, I was keeping a journal, and I wrote all this down, and I wrote a lot of things down that later made a lot of sense, but I couldn't believe at the time, well, if he were the guilty party, then he would have done this for this reason and so on. And I was sort of making connections without really believing them. And it was a little frightening later to reread everything I'd written and have all the things that I thought couldn't be true be true. And so anyway, I was sharing a lot of information with the detective, and he kept referring to him as the guy that did it, the perpetrator, we know he's the one. No, he couldn't be. But then I found myself saying, but if he were, then, this makes sense. And turned out that was right, but I couldn't believe it at the time.
So you were right.
I just couldn't believe it at the time. And so it was quite a while later that I and others could bring ourselves to believe that Mark was guilty of anything. And of course, there was nothing known about forgeries at the time. This was all bombings and, possible connection to document dealing. And I think you asked me if we were scared or if there was fear. I can't remember.
Yeah, were you fearful for your own safety?
I never felt like I was in imminent danger, although I knew it was a possibility. None of us knew. And there were lots of people that were kind of heading for the hills. So after I went to the police, then we all knew that there was a very real threat to further loss of life. And so I remember leaving the police station with Shannon Flynn. he says he had asked me if I wanted to go.
Who is Shannon?
Shannon was another friend of Mark's, did a lot of business with him. He got charged with, he helped Mark make an Uzi submachine gun into fully automatic. Anyway, but he'd done a lot. He was a friend and business associate of Mark, so there were several of those. Anyway, that didn't stick, and but he was, telling the police what he knew that was relevant and so on, and
so you said that didn't stick. What didn't stick?
Well,
the charges.
The charge they dropped that.
Because basically the charge was that he was aiding and abetting.
That he was helping him make an illegal weapon, basically. And so anyway, we were leaving at the same time. He asked if I wanted to go see Mark's car, which was over by the Deseret Gym, near the church office building that had been blown up. The car, not the Deseret Gym.
Which is now the conference center, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so I said, yeah, I would. And so we went out to his car, and we kind of looked at each other, and
you and Shannon.
Yes. And he opens his hood and looks under the hood. We look under the car for bombs. That's how paranoid we were. So, yeah, there was fear, or at least knowing that it was a possibility. But, yeah, there was a feeling of paranoia in the air for sure. And so then we drove over and looked at Mark's car, and as I recall, I can't remember, this may be in my imagination, but it seems like there were still little wisps of smoke and steam, it had burned up and they put it out. So
this was the same day?
The blackened hulk of a car. Same day, this was on the 16th.
Now, was this a pipe bomb or was it something else?
Pipe bomb. But it was not packed with shrapnel like the others were. Oh. So it was an explosive device without shrapnel. That's how he survived.
Oh,
so it
was meant. The two died.
So there's speculation as to whether it was what it was meant to do.
I've heard that people think that it was an accident that he blew up himself. I think it was.
I've
also heard that people thought that he did it to throw everybody off the case.
Right, you do.
What do you think?
It's possible that it was meant for Brent Ashworth. They used to meet together at the Crossroads Mall on, I think that was a Wednesday, if I remember right. I'm not positive on that, but they used to meet, and so there is speculation that he could have gotten Brent out of the way, who had become a real irritant and had just been fed up with Mark's shenanigans. They had lots of conflicts, and it wasn't like he suspected forgery or anything, but there have been so many botched deals and things that didn't come through the way they're supposed to, and Mark could be difficult to deal with financially, especially. He would bounce checks and he did that to me a couple of times, but he would he'd always make good, and you just put up with certain things. He had some idiosyncrasies that were a little strange.
It seems strange that he would bounce checks when he's making $40,000 on a document or whatever.
Yeah, it does.
But did he have another job besides this document?
No, that became his full-time job. But anyway, let me just get back to your earlier thing about the fear and so on. So shortly after, that night, I had talked to the police, and someone suggested that I have we lived in the county, and someone suggested that we have county sheriffs go out to my house and look for bombs. And so I sent my family to my mother-in-law's place, and so that our house would be vacant. And so I was there with two sheriff's deputies, and we were going through my house room by room, in the garage, in the yard. And there was actually kind of a lighter moment when I'm leading the way, pushing doors open gingerly. There was something in black plastic by my front door that I didn't remember what it was, and we're all looking at it like, what's that? And I'm thinking, I don't know. And it was big and wrapped in black plastic. So I called my wife, and she reminded me that a neighbor had brought it over for me to look at. So it was some old thing they wanted. So anyway, I'm pushing doors open and we're walking through and shining lights and, you know, these guys are ready for action. And I remember saying, hey, I don't get paid to do this. You do this. So I made one of them get in front of me and
you didn't have a flag jacket on.
Yeah, exactly. And so yeah, that was genuine. I guess you could say that was genuine fear, or at least the possibilities of what could happen. Particularly, I was worried about my family.
I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Curt Bench. As I mentioned before, he died August 17th, 2021 in Salt Lake City, and we'll really miss him. Continue to support Benchmark Books. His son Chris is running the store, and you can still get a lot of cool stuff there. In our next conversation, we're going to talk about Shannon Flynn, who you heard a little bit in that last interview. Shannon unfortunately passed away as well, and we'll first hear about him getting arrested in connection with the Mark Hofmann bombings.
And so I was at one point arrested for possession of an unregistered automatic firearm, which appears that's a federal crime under the tax code, strangely enough. And so then I spent 3 days in Salt Lake County Jail.
If you'd like to hear the entire interview uncut, please subscribe for just $5 a month at patreon.com/GospelTangents, and you can hear the entire interview before everybody else. If you'd like to watch the entire video for just $8 a month, you can either subscribe on YouTube, Patreon, or my website, GospelTangents.com. Just click the yellow subscribe button, and I'll add you to our Gospel Tangents Insiders group so that you can see entire videos. For those interested in a PDF transcript, you can subscribe at either Patreon or on my website. For just $10 a month, I'll send you a PDF as soon as it's complete. If you'd like a copy of the paperback as well as a PDF, just sign up for $20 a month at either Patreon or my website, GospelTangents.com. Of course, you can buy individual transcripts at Amazon.com and just do a search for Gospel Tangents interview and you can see all the things that we have there. Don't forget to support Gospel Tangents with an awesome t-shirt like one of these. You can subscribe at Apple Podcasts at tinyurl.com/GospelTangents. Get our latest updates at Facebook.com/GospelTangents. Also, you can get our Twitter updates at Gospel Tangents. Click here to subscribe, here for a transcript, and over here we've got more of our great videos. Thanks again.